Okay, welcome to your second course. This is Positive Psychology Coaching Basics, and this is class number 1. I'm Julia Stewart, as you've probably figured out, and let's get going. So in this course, it's just 3 classes. I'm going to introduce you to the basics of positive psychology coaching, and then we'll talk about connecting and clarifying basics in the next class, and finally creating basics and using strengths in the last class. So I hope you enjoy it, and you might want to take some notes so that you can remember what you learned. Okay, so we covered this in course number 1, which was an introduction to positive psychology. And here's our definition of positive psychology coaching at IAPPC. So it's a science-informed, customized conversation that empowers the client to grow and reach an important goal or vision. So what I mean by that is science-informed means that we pay attention to what the research is saying, but we also pay attention to the client and their needs and strengths and their values and their goals or vision. And we also rely on our own strengths, but also our intuition, our empathy, and our experience to coach the client. So we're not rigidly following research, but we're using it to enhance what already tends to work well in coaching. And then, of course, every conversation in coaching is customized. So we're not doing, we're not following a script or a formula. Those rarely work. We're not just following a set of competencies, but we are inventing or customizing or personalizing what happens in the conversation for every client as needed. And this empowers the client because we're responding to them rather than pushing them, directing them, or pulling them along. So we're responding to what they want and to how they're responding to the coaching. And growth comes because if the client has a big enough goal or vision, the reason they haven't gotten there yet is probably because they haven't grown into who they need to be to get there. So growth is always a part of really effective coaching that is sustainable and helps clients reach their goals. And then it says important goal. You could call that a heartfelt goal. It's something that really matters to the client, and it can be even more inspiring if we look at the client's vision for their entire life, or perhaps just vision for what they're working on now. So if they've got some career goals, then looking at their vision for their career can be really helpful. If they have goals that relate to happiness and well-being, finding out what their ultimate vision is for that can help you coach them, but also help them get there. So there are 4 basic steps to mastering coaching or mastering anything really. And you may have heard of these somewhere. I'm just going to talk about how they show up in coaching. So number 1 is you don't know what you don't know. That's a perfectly respectable place to be as a beginner. And some people taking this course probably are beginners to coaching, and welcome. That's a great place for you to be. Even if you are a beginner, by the end of this class, and certainly by the end of this course, you will step into you know what you don't know. So you're learning about what coaching is, discovering it, maybe having some aha moments, and your brain is literally changing a little bit because of what you're learning. But you still need to practice it. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. As you take more courses, so don't just stop here, unless you've already had years of coach training. Get to number 3, you know what you know. This is a great place to be, and it's where a lot of coaches are when they graduate from a coaching school, or if they've been working on becoming a coach for maybe, I don't know, 6 months or a year. They know what to do, but they still need to think about it because they haven't practiced quite enough for it to become second nature to them. So there are a lot of cute names that various schools use to talk about this. They'll talk about knowing it in your bones or cellular knowledge. I don't know. I like to stick a little bit closer to what researchers tell us. So when you know what you know, your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus and a few other parts of your brain, probably a lot of parts of your brain, have been doing a lot of processing, making changes, and you can consciously talk about coaching in a fairly knowledgeable way. There's still a challenge in actually coaching clients, though, because great coaching happens when the coach can pay all their attention to the client, what the client wants and what they're saying, and what's going on in the coaching session itself, and what's going on inside the coach. So it's very mindful. You have to be very present, and going and thinking about how to do things distracts you from that. So it's a bit of a problem to be in that place. But if you keep practicing, you get to that magical number 4 where you don't know what you know. And that sounds a little bit crazy, but what happens is that as you practice more and more and more, your brain begins to move some of that information into your subconscious. And it will stay there, particularly if you keep coaching a lot, and it will be there when you need it. So you don't have to hold it in your conscious mind and think about it while you're doing it. Rather, it's just there. And you notice things about what's going on with the client. You can make some predictions that as you get more experience usually become more and more accurate. And if somebody listens to you coach, this happens a lot in coaching schools, the teacher coaches and the students go, wow, how did she do that? How did she know? And it sounds really magical and like they have some sort of superpower that you don't have. They don't. What they have is practice. You can have it too. But you do need to work a lot. And the great thing about this is if you're really cut out to be a coach, you probably love coaching. It might be your favorite activity. It's one of mine. And if you love to coach, you'll probably keep coaching a lot. And that's how you become a masterful coach. That's one of the reasons why people who really enjoy coaching say it's the perfect profession. So that's where you're headed. And in the meantime, it might feel sometimes intimidating or confusing, and you might feel like, I don't know if I can do this. That's actually kind of a great place to be because every coach needs some humility. And humility doesn't necessarily mean what a lot of people assume it means. For one thing, it sounds a lot like the word humiliation, which nobody wants to experience. It's similar to the word humble, but that's not a real appealing word to a lot of people either. Actually, according to researchers, humility and being humble are a good description for self-esteem that is balanced with empathy. And as it turns out, empathy and self-esteem have kind of an inverse relationship with each other. So people who have really high self-esteem, the people who are confident when they don't know what they're doing and who, brag about themselves or whatever, um, they tend to have low empathy. And the funny thing about coaching is you'll never be very good at it if you don't have pretty good empathy. So it's tough for some people to do it. But if you're feeling a little insecure, it could be that you're not somebody like that. And I'll talk about the opposite end of that scale, which would have would be to have low self-esteem, but very high empathy. So people like that can coach a bit, but they tend to get hung up in some places. You really need some confidence to be a coach. In fact, in my early days of coach training, I made up a silly word and it kind of makes me groan to even think about it, but the English language doesn't have a good word for this, so I made it up. It's a contraction of confidence and humility. It's confility. That's what you actually need. So you do need some self-esteem. You need to feel good about yourself and confident about yourself. Not the braggy sort of confidence, but just like, yeah, if I try this and work at it, I can do it. That's a perfect level of confidence. And it's balanced with empathy. So when it's balanced, not only do you see your own self-worth in a pretty realistic way, but you also see other people's worth in a realistic way. And you pay attention to your own needs and your own self-compassion, but you also know that other people deserve to have their needs met and you have compassion for them. And so it's balanced. So you're in a good place if you're a little confused. And here's something that was sent to me by a good friend of mine years ago. His name is Sunstar, and he used to be the best known, the most famous stock photographer in the world. And he sent me a lot of photos over the years, which I'm really grateful for. One day out of the blue, he sent this to me. It was just something he put together. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, some people need to see this. So I asked him, can I share this with my students? And he said, sure. So, yeah, so you are here now. You are the caterpillar. Nothing wrong with being a caterpillar. They can eat something like 20 times their weight in leaves. And that pruning may actually be good in some environments. Um, the caterpillar doesn't know what he doesn't know. He doesn't know that there are relatives of his that can fly literally from the northern hemisphere to the southern hemisphere and vice versa. Unbelievable that a bug can do that, but he'll be able to do it one day too. So that's kind of where you are. And while you're learning to coach, some things may get confusing. Things that you've been taught in the past are kind of not very useful in coaching, and we may even approach it almost from the opposite. And as we learn more about research, some of the research is surprising. So that can cause your brain to get a little scrambled, kind of like a caterpillar in a chrysalis. Scientists tell us that they literally just turn into a massive goo. It's incredible that an animal can do that and then turn into what seems like a completely different animal. So they transform in the chrysalis, and that's completely normal for them. It's not that they are a lowly caterpillar or a lowly chrysalis. They're actually pretty extraordinary that they can do this. And so the real you, this is how I see you anyway, is the butterfly. That's where you're going. Keep your eye on that. And if a different metaphor works better for you, if you want to see yourself as a lion, awesome. Whatever works for you, but I like to use the butterfly. So let's talk a little bit about what helps you become a great coach. So I mentioned self-compassion a few minutes ago, and you might be familiar with this. The researcher it's most associated with is Kristen Neff. She's not the only researcher who has explored it, however. And in Western culture, actually a lot of cultures, self-compassion isn't really taught. We're taught to um, pay more attention to having compassion for others. And there's that saying, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, that's compassion for others. But what you would want them to do unto you, that's compassion for you. You can do it for yourself. Sometimes there's nobody handy to take care of you. And sometimes really it's nobody else's responsibility, but it is yours because you cannot be a great coach if your needs aren't met. And that means somebody's got to meet your needs all the time. So this becomes your project, not because you are the greatest of all time and you deserve more than everybody else. It's not like that. It's not because you're a snowflake. It's actually kind of the opposite of snowflakes. So you might call it an iron snowflake is what you become. So you care for your fragility and you also bolster your strength. And so self-compassion, there are many steps to it. One of them, which I've found really helpful, is when you're feeling down, remind yourself that there are a lot of other people feeling the same way. You are not alone. You are not unique. You are not inferior to others. There are a billion people feeling anything at any moment. And so recall that. And then the word after that is self-care. This word, or if you can call it, it's a phrase. Um, it's getting a little bit bashed these days because folks are getting tired of it. There are cliches about it that people don't care for. So I think the predominant cliche of self-care is about taking bubble baths or getting massages or getting a facial. And spa stuff is fine if that's what works for you with self-care. But I like to tell my students, if the best way for you to relax and get happy is to go to a NASCAR race, that's your self-care. If the best way for you to relax and feel happy is to bake cookies with your grandchildren, that also is self-care. Your self-care is whatever makes you feel your best. And for most of us, we need more relaxation and just a little more positivity. So you do need to take this seriously. It is not optional for you. The day you decided to become a professional coach, you also decided to practice self-compassion and self-care. That is, if you expect to be effective on an ongoing basis. And scientists have a word for this type of action. It's prosocial. Prosocial actions cause us to be kinder to other people. And if you don't take care of yourself, you won't be as kind as possible to others, and you won't have compassion for others as much. Coaches do need to be pro-social, and they need to get their basic needs met. So you probably, at some point, you may have forgotten, in high school or college, you studied general psychology and you heard about Abraham Maslow's theory of needs. Well, that theory is still pretty valid today. It's also become mythologized into things that it was never really intended to be. But the basic needs part, really important. So things like your body's basic functioning, you got to care for all that. And if you're somebody who likes to live on 5 or 6 hours and drink lots of coffee, you may need to change that. And in fact, as you get older, your body may change it for you, because what worked when you were young, take it from me, it stops working as you get older. And so you'll find yourself wanting to sleep more rather than having more fun. But yeah, so your body's basic needs, safety, and safety is kind of a physical need, but also a psychological need. So take care that you are as safe as you need to be. Some people are very adventuresome and like to take risks. Others, not so much. Find the happy middle for you. And love and belonging is something that's very important. It's one of the reasons why self-compassion is so powerful, because if you have love and belonging with yourself, you become pretty centered. You become pretty healthy. You become someone who can put your ego out of the way and help somebody else, which is a big part of what coaching is. And you have self-esteem and achievement and accomplishment, um, and self-actualization and self-transcendence. So I'm not going to go all into Maslow's needs, but we'll probably talk about them in some other classes. But self-compassion and self-care help you to be your best, and you need to be your best to coach. You will think that you can fake it. You cannot. Coaching demands something of you that you can't do when you're stressed out. You can't do it when somebody has just yelled at you. There are a lot of things that you simply can't mix with coaching. And so you need to protect that about yourself going forward. Okay, and then there are your strengths, and I'm going to talk about character strengths in a moment. And I want to kind of put a little public bulletin out. So right now we're still doing free coach training, and we don't have a lot of requirements for coaches other than giving us a lot of information about yourself. One of the things we ask about on the first application, and that's the application to take the test, the written test, is your top 5 character strengths. And I've noticed that some of the people who apply don't know what their top 5 character strengths are. They fill in some stuff, like 20 years of experience or something like that. That's not your strength. So if you're not quite sure what VIA character strengths are, go to the website viacharacter.org and take the test. It's real quick, and you will get an answer about your top 5 character strengths. And at that point, you will move from you don't know what you don't know to you know what you don't know. And that will be the beginning of your journey of learning to master your strengths. Because in positive psychology coaching, we don't coach with competencies. We coach with strengths, your strengths. And that's how you become um, a unique coach who can coach some people better than anyone else can. And so you get to be yourself rather than copying someone else, which is the opposite of a strengths-based approach. And you become a better coach, and you can probably master coaching a lot faster. So you don't need to coach like I coach, but you do need to coach effectively, and you'll probably do it a little bit differently from me. And then something else that you need maybe a little bit more than before, although not too much, is positivity. So most people are not as positive as they could benefit from being. That said, there are a lot of people out there, and some of them call themselves coaches, who teach ideas about maximum positivity. You never say no to anything. Every situation you interpret it according to the positive. And if you do that really, really well, you might get everything you want just by thinking about it. Um, those programs sometimes make a lot of money for the people who are leading the programs, but they often leave the people they teach kind of broken and miserable and disappointed. So positivity feels great at first, especially when you're practicing a lot of it. And you may feel that as you're learning to coach, and that's great. That's kind of, Barbara Fredrickson used to call that the tipping point of positivity. And it's a wonderful feeling. It tends to not last forever. And that's the reason why I'm kind of warning you a little bit about toxic positivity, because they're just, it's just a shame. There are dishonest people who teach this stuff, call it coaching, but it's actually a form of manipulation, and it can get kind of cult-like. And one of our members referred to coaching schools as multi-level marketing cults. And yeah, some of them are like that. And then some of them are legitimate. It's hard to tell the difference. But one difference is, do they expect you to be positive all the time? Because that's crazy making. And while you're crazy, that's when they start manipulating you. Or do they suggest that you might want to be a little more positive and actually give you some data to back up why that might be? That's a much more honest position. And if you want to learn more about positivity, take course number 1. And if you have already taken it, start reading up about some of the researchers that are mentioned in that course. And that'll get you on track. So I would suggest that you start with Barbara Fredrickson's positivity book, because it's an easy read. It's easy to understand. It was written several years ago, so she may have changed some of her data since then, based on newer research. But that's a good place to begin and start to get an idea of what positivity is all about. It can help you and your coaching clients, but not if you roll into toxicity. Okay, so something else that you need is practice, practice, practice. I've already talked about this, but now I'm making kind of another groaner joke here. There used to be a vaudeville joke about somebody's trying to find their way to Carnegie Hall, famous music hall in New York City. You need to be a pretty great musician to play there. So how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. If you want to get on stage, you better be a great musician. If you want to be a great coach, you have to practice, practice, practice. This goes for all of us. No matter how good you are now, you probably could be better. So if you're spending a fair amount of time on your practice, you'll become a great coach sooner. I recommend, if you're in your first year of coaching, that you find yourself 3 to 5 clients. They don't have to be paying clients. Ideally, they're not your husband or your brother or your best friend. You could ask those people to put you in contact with some people who might like to coach with you, and you don't have to charge them. I think I said that, but you could. I have kind of a rule of thumb for giving away coaching. Um, I always set a limit of about 3 months for free coaching. After that, if the client really likes your coaching, they're probably willing to pay you something, and you can negotiate what that is. If you're willing to coach for $25 a month, that's very generous of you. But if you want to make 10 times that or more, that's fine too. So you can start coaching for pay pretty quickly. You do not have to be certified to charge, but it helps if you're on your way to getting certified. So with time, you will soar as a coach. And here's what will help you soar. This is a list of the 24 character strengths. These have been well researched, and this is why we're choosing these strengths. There are some other well-known strengths, such as the Clifton strengths. I like the Clifton strengths very much. There are a number of things about character strengths that make them a little more useful for coaching. One is that the research on character strengths is in the public domain, so we know what it is and we can learn a lot about it. If you want to use Clifton strengths and you want to learn all the research about it, you'll have to pay several $1,000s to the Gallup organization to do that. And it may well be worth it. So I'm not trying to tell you not to do that, but these we can access for free, and we can start learning about them by reading books, taking courses at viacharacter.org. I'll also do some teaching about character strengths, particularly as they apply to coaching. So you probably have some type of relationship with all of these strengths, and but some of them you will be using more often than others. And the top 5 are called your signature strengths, and those are the ones our applications ask for. So we actually have 2 applications for the certification. Um, the first one is to take the written test. The second one is to submit a recording of your self-coaching. They both ask about your character strengths. Because we're still gathering up information about coaches so that we can set requirements for our certification in the future, if somebody doesn't know their character strengths on the first application, I kind of let that go. Usually by the time they've taken the test, they realize they might need to learn more about character strengths. And so when we have them fill out the second application, you need to know what your character strengths are. So if you do nothing else, go to viacharacter.org and find out what they are. That's the beginning. It's your first step. All right, so we do have certain things that tend to show up in a coaching session, and these are some simplified activities, behaviors, or skills. We can call them a lot of things, um, that any coach will do. So I've trained a lot of coaches with these foundations, and some of them don't stick around for more training. They just go off and start coaching. These are not the skills that we use when you submit a coaching session for certification. We have a more advanced set for that. There are 10 of them, but this will get you started. So there are a lot of things you need to understand about coaching, and these 8 foundations, they're kind of easy to understand. So let's go. So the first thing is to know that the coaching session is all about the coaching client. It's not about you. So it's different from a social conversation in that social conversations, one person says something, somebody else says something else, and they go back and forth. Someone will say, oh, I had this terrible experience at the grocery store. And the second person will say, I had that same experience last week. What's going on with that? And you will both get excited talking about that. And then there are um, conversations with an expert of some sort, an advisor, such as, oh, a tax accountant or a lawyer or a physician. They're giving you information. That's the main thing that you pay them for. There are some actions that they take also, but when you're consulting with them, it's mainly about the information that they're exchanging with you. Coaching is not like that. What you are responsible for as a coach is to know how to coach. And other than that, it's all about the client. You'll notice at the bottom of this list, there's something called have something to talk about. That's a caveat, but let's go back up to the top and talk about it's all about them. This really helps if you have been practicing mindfulness for a while, or if you're very good at presencing, which is kind of the same thing. So you're very present to the client. You're not competing with them with the things you say or even the things you ask, but you're listening to them, asking questions, giving them some feedback. There is a little bit of back and forth there, but the client is doing most of the talking. I have a friend who used to be a coach trainer, and she gave her students a rule of thumb that I think is helpful so long as you don't hang on to it too tightly. So this is a rule of thumb. It's not a rule of every coaching session. You will probably break it more often than you don't. But if you can stay pretty close to these numbers, you're pretty well on track, so long as you're not letting them distract you. So it's an 80-20 rule. And the rule is the client does 80% of the talking, the client does 20% of the talking. But then it goes a little further. Out of that 20% of talking that you get to do when you're coaching, 80% is asking, only 20% is telling. So that comes down to about 4%. 4% of a coaching session is you talking about something that you know, like positive psychology. So that's one of the ways that you make it all about them. Let them do most of the talking. You just keep asking questions about that. And occasionally you share a little bit of something that might be helpful. Then there's validate continuously. And I want to make sure that you know that the word validate does not mean that it has to always be positive. So we're doing it continuously, but we're also paying attention to what's going on. So if your client is having a really hard time, maybe they've been working on a big project and you've been helping them with it for a few weeks, and they come back for another coaching session and they just seem whipped. Everything went wrong. They're discouraged, they're tired, they haven't reached their goals, they're wondering if they ever can. You can validate that. That's real. In fact, if you fail to validate that, you're not being compassionate. So you can acknowledge them with something like, so it sounds like this is really hard right now. And they'll feel a little bit seen and understood. You can follow that up with a question. What's the biggest problem here in your opinion? Could be a question you could ask, and let them tell you that. Another thing that you can do is, this has been around for a long time, and it's really helpful because most of your coaching session will be fairly positive, but you do need to make room for the negative. There's something called BMW time, and I'm going to use a bad word, so close your ears if you can't bear that. BMW stands for bitch, moan, and whine. And you can work something out with your clients where they can spend as much as 5 minutes, the first 5 minutes of a coaching session, telling you everything that's going wrong, and you can commiserate with them. I am not afraid to say to my clients, wow, that really sucks. I'm sorry it's happening. To just be there with them because that helps them move through it. And if they don't move through it, they won't be ready for the positive. So if you're hammering them with positivity when they feel like, you know what, they're going to feel worse, not better, and they may quit as a result. It doesn't work. And that's why we call it toxic positivity, because it's toxic. So give your clients time. I'll give you a quick story. Many years ago, a client hired me to help her with personal development. That was great. She was a great client. But almost as soon as she hired me, her husband left her for her best friend. And her husband was a real piece of work. She would tell me week after week the awful things that he did, really just terrible. Um, but after a couple of weeks, I noticed we're not getting enough done um, of what she actually hired me for. It's her coaching, so she can use it any way she wants. It's all about her. So I asked her, so I notice we're not spending a lot of time on your personal development. And this is your coaching, so we can do whatever you want with these conversations. But I just want to own up to the fact that I'm not a therapist. So if you're looking for that, I will be terrible at that, but I am a really good coach. So would you like to work on what you hired me for, or talk about what's going wrong? And she said, well, I'd really like to talk about what I hired you for, but this stuff is going on. And I said, yeah, I totally understand. What about if we did like 5 minutes of BMW time at the beginning of each coaching session? I will totally commiserate with you. And then maybe we'll do a switch when you're ready, approximately 5 minutes, we hope, and we'll work on what you hired me for. So she agreed with that. And that's what we did. She did really well with her personal development. She, as I said, she was a great client. And she was probably lucky that her husband left her because, like I said, he was a real piece of work. Um, so validate continuously is about getting what's going on with the client. If you're not sure, be sure to ask about it. You don't have a crystal ball, so don't imagine that you've got them figured out if you don't ask. And validate what's going well, validate the fact that they're showing up, because some days that's hard. Validate the fact that they're working on a really hard project. That's what they hired you for. And it may feel hard some weeks, and some weeks it may feel awesome. Validate all of that. And the client will open up to you as you do that. And then your curiosity and the other things that you bring to the table will work, instead of your client feeling like they're being peppered with questions when what they really need is somebody to say, I get it, this is really hard right now. So let's say you've done that really well and your client is becoming more receptive, more relaxed, more open. That's when you can really use your curiosity. And by the way, curiosity is a character strength. If you happen to have that one, it can be really useful in your coaching, but there are other things that you can use that can be very helpful too. So there's also a character strength of learning, which is a lot like curiosity, but sometimes a little more structured. And then there's also social intelligence, which can involve some curiosity. So being curious is about being really present to the moment and wondering more about that, and then asking questions about it. And I will talk about certain types of questions that work really well at certain points in coaching. But I want you to know from the get-go, it's your natural curiosity that is most helpful. And if it shows up a little differently for you because your strengths are different, you're a learner. That's actually what I am. I score higher on learning than on curiosity. Or it's your social intelligence, which is similar to emotional intelligence. You can use those, but that's what really drives the questions you ask. Once you've mastered coaching and you don't know what you know anymore, you can just be naturally curious and present, and the right kinds of questions will tend to just show up as you need them. Pretty cool. All right, and then it says fine tune your antenna. This is because all the curiosity in the world doesn't matter for anything unless you are hearing it. And sometimes coaches hear with more than their ears. So you might be somebody who is um, very verbal and very linear and organized in your thinking. And that is a great way to listen. That might be your primary way. But even if you're one of those people, you probably have other ways that you pick up information. So we pick up information from people's tone of voice. We pick it up from non-words that they say. Scientists call these vocal bursts, like, huh, or huh. So you can pick up a lot from that. You can pick up a lot of information from the client's facial expressions, also their body language, if you can see them. You really don't have to be able to see a client to coach well, though. It's really what you can hear that probably matters more than anything else. But there's also what's going on inside of you as well as what's going on inside of them. So you're simultaneously paying attention to all of that. You're curious about all of that and you're taking it in. So your antenna or multiple antennae are finely tuned. And this may show up differently for you than it shows up for others. So um, scientists say that intuition is our unconscious or subconscious mind. It's actually a slight difference, but I'm not going to get into that. Picking up information that our conscious minds are not aware of. You're picking up like thousands of bits of information all the time, but you're really only focused on one of those things or a few of those things. And so your brain takes that stuff in, but it doesn't necessarily tell you about it, not in words anyway. And yet it can bubble up to the surface in some ways. So some coaches have gut feelings, and those are real. Your intestines actually do have neurons in them, and they do take in information and share it with your brain. You can feel it in your heart area. And again, your heart has a lot of neurons, and more information passes to your brain from your heart than passes from your brain to your heart. There's also something in the heart area, and actually goes all the way down into your gut. This is how these organs communicate with the brain. It's called the vagus nerve. Really fascinating, and it delivers certain chemicals to your body or sends them up. And so you'll feel certain things, like you might feel some warmth for your client, and you might feel that in your chest. That could be some oxytocin being delivered to your bloodstream, or it could be something else. I've read some research recently that suggests that maybe oxytocin isn't the only thing that's going on when people are feeling close, but you'll get feelings in parts of your body. You might get visual pictures in your mind's eye. You might just get a funny feeling. Thomas Leonard used to say he had a funny feeling in his big toe because he was making light of it. And coaching conversations tend to work best when they're kind of light. Um, but get to know how things show up for you. So specifically about intuition, ask yourself, do I have intuition or not? Most coaches would say yes. I would say virtually everyone has it, but some people may not be using it. So if you're saying no, you might start looking for evidence of it. If you do have intuition, ask yourself how it shows up for you. Does it show up as a feeling somewhere in your body, for instance? Does it show up as a picture in your mind? Does it show up as a still small voice, which the Bible talks about? I get that one. And it's really interesting because it's basically my voice, but it doesn't feel like it's coming from me. And it could be somebody could be yelling at me, and a little voice will tell me what's really going on with that person. Or one time it saved me when I was getting mugged. It helped me make the right choice to basically save my life because the voice said, just cooperate. He's only going to take your money. I thought he was going to kill me. Um, but the voice knew better. Anyway, um, notice, how do you get intuition? Because that's how you want to be using it during coaching. And it can come up in really unusual ways. I had a student one who had synesthesia, which basically means that there is some wiring in the brain, some nerve endings that are very close to each other, that may involve different types of senses. So some people experience numbers as colors, for instance. Um, it can involve all kinds of uh, different combinations of sensory information that's just a little different from most of what most of the rest of us experience. So I had a student who had this, and but whenever she coached, it sounded like she would get very intellectual and work really hard using her brain to figure out what was going on, which isn't really the best way to coach most of the time. So I just suggested that she be a little more intuitive. And she shared with me privately that she had synesthesia. And she was afraid that the things that were coming up for her might be a little too weird for other people, for the clients. I said, well, that may be. I don't know. The only way to find out is for you to share them. So she started sharing in class the visions or feelings or understandings that were coming up for her. They were indeed unusual, and I suppose we could call them weird, but I mostly found them fascinating. And her clients had the most interesting insights when she shared them. So they weren't wrong. They were just her intuition, and they helped the client experience their situation a little differently. So they had insights, and insights are what coaching's all about. Well, it's one of the things coaching's all about. So let's move on to prime the pump. Um, this is it actually uses a pump as a metaphor. So a pump basically, you can use it in a couple of ways. You can push, let's say water, you can push water through it, or you can create a vacuum and pull water through it. And sometimes that's a more effective way to do it. And so that's what they call priming the pump. And there's a technique, or it's actually a combination of techniques in coaching that work quite well this way. You're kind of using a vacuum to pull insights or information from the client. And it takes some practice to learn when and how to do it, but basically it involves asking a big question. So this is a question that's perhaps very personal and also very important to the client. And you ask it and give the client some time, some silence. That's the vacuum. And a lot of times something will just burst forward from oh, I know what it is. It's blah, 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 blah. And I often use an example. It's probably not the perfect example here, but it really stood out for me. And so I've always remembered it. And this isn't exactly in a coaching session, but I'll set up this story for you. So it's in a coaching class. One coach is coaching the other one. The one who's being coached has had an experience that didn't work very well, and he wasn't happy with how he handled it. And a few times during the course of the coaching, which was quite short, it was maybe 10 or 12 minutes, he mentioned the word cowardly 3 times. Well, there's kind of a rule in coaching. If the client keeps mentioning a particular word, you need to ask about it. There's another rule that if a client uses a very emotional word, you probably should ask about it. So in this case, the client has used it 3 times in a short period, and it's a very emotionally charged word, cowardly. So the person coaching um, this person was a new coach. They didn't ask about the word cowardly, and they really didn't get very far in the 10 or 12 minutes. And of course, that's a very short time for coaching, so I didn't expect them to, get to world peace in 10 minutes, but um, I was giving them some feedback, and I pointed out that the person they were coaching had used the word cowardly 3 times. And that might have been a good word to ask about, because when you ask about certain words, that's when clients have certain insights. It's almost like they're dropping breadcrumbs. They're hoping you will notice and ask about it, something that they're not quite ready to say. They're not quite ready to admit it to themselves, or they feel embarrassed, or something's uncomfortable. So they're not going to blurt it out. And they're probably not even conscious that they're doing this, but they've left you some clues. So follow up on those clues. So I said, you know, you could ask a question point blank to him. And if you're worried that it will hurt his feelings or insult him, by all means, ask permission first. So you can say, I've got a question, kind of a challenging question I want to ask. Would that be okay with you? And if the client says yes, honestly, you can get away with asking them almost anything once they've said yes. That is the magic word. Please is the key to opening it up. And so ask the client, would it be okay if I ask you about this? They say yes. And then, for instance, you can ask, so were you being cowardly? And in this situation, the person who was being coached, he was there while I was giving feedback. He burst out laughing. He said, yes, that's it. I felt cowardly about it, and that's why I'm so uncomfortable. I let my wife handle this, and she handled it really well, but I felt like I was really kind of ducking out and leaving her with a difficult problem. And so from there, you can coach the client like, so, okay, we've all done that. Um, yeah, does that really make you a coward though? I mean, maybe it's just you had a moment where you couldn't handle something. So, you can coach them however you want from there. Usually you want them to get over their shame, because it's really hard to move forward if you're feeling ashamed of themselves. And you might talk to him. So what do you want to do about this? And he was a great guy. He said, I'm going to go home and apologize to my wife and talk about it with her, and that's all I really need to do. So um, uh, end of problem. The client knows what he wants to do, but sometimes we feel uncomfortable with something, but we can't even admit it to ourselves. But if you've got a good relationship with your client, for instance, if you make it all about them and you validate continuously, they might share it with you. Clients often share things with their coaches that they don't share with their spouses, or they might share them first with the coach and then with the spouse. So that's how Prime the Pump works, and we'll talk about these more later. I'm just introducing you. The next one says be big, and this one I've used different wording for it at different times. Inspires greatness is another version of it, but the greatness word sometimes confuses people. This is not about your ego being the greatest, so it's not about pounding on your chest and yelling, I am the greatest. This is about your true greatness. So your ego is a wonderful thing. A lot of people hate the ego. It's kind of like, I don't know, the Windows operating system. It's the operating system everybody loves to hate. But you were born with an ego for a very good reason. Or let me back up, because psychologists say we don't really develop the ego until later on. But you were born with the possibility of developing an ego for a very good reason. And that is because you can't survive without it. Your ego is the only entity that is 100% for you and you only. It might be willing to get out of the way now and then so you can have relationships with other people. It likes that, so that's fine. But it's mainly just about you. And so you need a little bit of ego. That's that high self-esteem thing. So low self-esteem is not so great. I mentioned that coaches with low self-esteem and high empathy can coach, but because they have low self-esteem, they might try rescuing their clients or helping them a little too much, taking on too great of a burden, or they'll worry constantly that they're not good enough, and that worry will cause them to coach less effectively. So you do need a little bit of ego, but you need for it to be willing to step out of the way while you coach. And I started a little visualization when I was in the early stages of my coaching career. I would imagine telling my ego, um, go get a cup of coffee. I got this. And I imagine it just kind of sitting quietly on my shoulder, kind of like the elf on the shelf. Yeah, so it would sit on my shoulder while the true big part of me got to coach. The big part of you, it goes by different names. It shows up in a lot of religions. Could be called the true self, the authentic self, the real you. Um, One of my clients called it her inner earth mother. Whatever that is to you, and every client may have a different name for it. I call it my higher self. Um, that is the magnanimous part of you. It's the loving part of you. It's the compassionate part. It's the part that really wants to support this person at being their best. And that means we're not going to do their work for them, because then we're letting them play small, and we're kind of playing small by not doing our jobs correctly. We're going to let them struggle a little bit if they really need to, but we're not going to put them through struggles intentionally to give them a harder time. We are there for them. It's all about them. So that's what being big is about. And it's a come from. It's not something you do, but it changes how you do everything. And it probably should be the first item on the list, but for some reason it's down there towards the bottom. You can use this from the very beginning of the coaching to the very end. But one thing that's cool about it, lots of things are cool about it, but one thing that's a little unexpected is that it's contagious. If you're in your bigness, let's call it, your client often will show up that way too. And that's a very creative, kind of fearless, curious place to be from. It's much more present. It's less neurotic, less, like, oh, what could go wrong? And I'm not good at this. And oh my God. And it's more like, wow, what would happen if I did try that? That's when the client's being big. So you need to be big so they're more likely to be big. And again, we'll talk about this more later. Now we're getting down to the later stages of the coaching session. So your client has hopefully had some insights because you've been really curious and you've really heard them, and you've been really big. And so they're having some insights, and they're having the insights they need to have because they almost always will immediately start making plans for what they're going to do outside the coaching session, which is ultimately what coaching is all about. It's about what they're going to do next. So, um, clients sometimes don't need a lot of help here. Some clients don't need any help at all. But a lot of clients will think mainly on like willpower stuff, like relying on themselves, when they might get where they need to go by asking for help more often, or they might need to learn some more. Again, people don't know what they don't know. And if your client doesn't know, they might not even realize that they need help in that area. So here, you don't take over and start building for them. The way a coach builds is by asking questions. So you can ask them some questions like, do you need to learn anything before you can do this? Where could you learn it? If they say, well, it costs too much. Well, how could you do it for free or low fee? That's one of my favorite questions, because a lot of times people will say, well, I would do this, except I don't have the money. Well, that's baloney. You can find what you need. You can do it if you really want to, um, but you might do it a little bit differently. You can also ask questions about who else can help you, and it can be great to pair a client up with someone who has very different strengths. So the strengths that your client has, they will be great for helping them reach their goals. but in some cases, they might need some other strengths as well. And so by pairing them up, I don't mean you go and find somebody for them, but rather ask them who who's able to do this, or who do you know who's really good at this, who might be willing to have a conversation with you about it. Um, you know, people love to be generous, especially big people. They love to be generous because that allows them to use their magnanimous self. So don't be afraid to ask for help. You're giving a high functioning person one of the most enjoyable things they could have. So you're asking them questions about what they're going to need. And while you're listening to them talk about what they're going to do, just be asking yourself, so what's missing here? Or what might be missing? And that's how you choose your questions. And you want to choose different forms of scaffolding if you have time. So it could be setting up their office so it works very smoothly for them. So organizing everything. It might be hiring an assistant or a virtual assistant even. So they have somebody taking care of the things that they can't take care of themselves. Or it could be working with someone who can teach them the things they don't know yet. It can also be, heart in throat, taking some steps that feel scary and unknown. But you can build scaffolding for what will help them have the confidence to take those steps. So that's what building scaffolding is all about. And having something to talk about is a form of building scaffolding. And for this, I would say you would be talking about what you know about positive psychology. Many coaches just use strengths in their coaching. That's the only tool they use. They use their own strengths while they coach, and they help the client discover their strengths and apply them towards getting what they want. So strengths are assets, and your client has them. Help them to use them. Too many of us have gotten the message that we need to do things the way other people do them. So, I live in the United States. If you went to public school in the United States, you probably were taught that you needed to pass some tests, and there were correct answers and incorrect answers. And so you got very focused on doing things correctly. And that's one of the biggest impediments to becoming a great coach, by the way. But your clients also have this erroneous idea. Using your own strengths will help you to achieve things differently from how anybody else did it. And it doesn't matter that it doesn't look like what those people did. It's your way of doing it. And once you've done it, other people are going to be trying to figure out how to do it your way. And if you're generous, you'll say, use your own strengths and practice a lot. Anyway, have something to talk about. That could be anything in coaching. You could talk about, if we're talking about relationships, you could talk about active and constructive responding. If we're talking about pessimism versus optimism, you could talk about what you know about positivity. If it's about growing and learning, you could talk about um, growth theory and how thinking that you have to be talented or smart is rigid, and people who think that way tend to not reach their goals as often as people who are open-minded and believe that they can learn what they need to know. So those are just a few examples. They are by all means not everything that you could use from positive psychology. So start learning more about positive psychology. One way that you can do that is to start participating in the positive psychology book club and read a book on positive psychology once a month and meet with some smart and interesting coaches to talk about it. Yeah, let me move on because time is passing. So on the right in this table, you'll see all the foundations. Be Big says inspire greatness. So the wording is a little bit differently in a couple of places. Don't let that scare you off. And they are um, kind of put next to the meta skills. So you can see where you might be using these in a coaching session. So the meta skills, I believe, yeah, I introduced them in the positive psychology course. I'll just touch on them a little bit here. Um, I was looking for a way to just boil down coaching to the most basic stuff. So people could start coaching by paying attention to their clients rather than trying to remember a list of foundations or tools or competencies or whatever they're working with. And so I came up with this: connect, clarify, and create. That's all you do. And those other words there, those R words, those are the ways the client tends to show up. So at the beginning of a coaching session, and sometimes at other points during the coaching session, your client might be a little resistant. Um, Let's see, there are some other words for this. Psychotherapists use the word defensive. It's similar to resistance, but not exactly the same. Neuroscientists, I have even better words for this. They talk about the stress response. So you may have heard of the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. That's the stress response. And when people are in the stress response, um, their minds tend to close down a little bit, not completely, but your focus gets narrow. You narrowly focus on solving the problem that you're concerned about. And in coaching, we need our clients to open up their minds. So we need to get them out of the stress response and get them into the relaxation response, which you may also have heard of, sometimes called the rest and digest response. There are other names for it, but you get the idea. So these are two opposing responses that everybody has. There are some activities that kind of blend the two of them together, but most of the time we're mainly doing one or mainly doing the other. Um, let's see, playing a game. You might be using a little bit of both. So there's a little bit of stress, a little bit of relaxation, because when you're relaxed, you usually play better. Um, and that's a combination. But in coaching, most of the time in the coaching session, we want the client relaxed. And our most effective tool to do that is connecting. Make it all about them, validate everything, come from your bigness, not your ego. The ego tends to be kind of judgy and tends to get into conflicts with others, and that raises stress. So we get into our greatness instead. And if we do that really well, the client becomes more receptive, more open-minded, more curious, more positive, more optimistic. And when they get to that point, that's when we can really be curious, ask nosy questions. If the timing is right, we can prime the pump, and a lot of information will be coming out. So we'll raise our antenna so that we can hear that, we can know that, we can learn about it. And if we do that really well, particularly when we get to the prime the pump moment, the client will have insights and they will know something now that they didn't know. And their brain will be making connections that weren't there before. So they might need a moment to reorient around that. But if they've had the insight they need, they'll probably start saying things like, oh, I know what I could do. I can do blah, blah, blah. And then they'll write it down. Or they'll say, I need to put this on my calendar. Or, oh, I need to talk to Bob Jones. He knows about this. So they'll say something like that, and you know they're going into their resourceful phase. So they've got resources and they are thinking of them. Before, they had a problem, something that they wanted, but they couldn't get it, despite the fact that they had their resources. Now they realize, oh, I have these resources, and they start thinking about them, and you help them out with that by asking questions that help them to provide scaffolding. And if needed, you have something to talk about. You don't have to limit what you talk about to just positive psychology, but I highly recommend that you include it. So if you know a lot about something, maybe 2% of the conversation could be about that. Learning to communicate in ways that communicates a lot of information in a short time is a big part of what makes coaching successful. So by the end of the coaching session, the client should have an idea of what they want to do next and a plan for doing it. and they know when they're going to get started, or they have a good idea when they're going to get started. Um, the difficult thing about this is that the client doesn't necessarily go through these three meta skills in order or only once. It may go round and round. You may need to reconnect at some point because they become resistant, like the goal is so big that they're overwhelmed. Or you may start to do some more clarifying. They may be receptive, but not quite resourceful. So you need to stay on the clarifying. So not every coaching session uh, moves along the same way, but these are the things that tend to show up. All right, so that's most of our class. And here are some ideas for learning more while you're waiting for the next class to be uploaded. So, particularly if you're new to coaching, try having at least one conversation in the next week where you make it all about the other person. Just try doing that. You maybe don't know all the ways to do it, but I'll bet you know a bunch of them. So just do that and notice what happens. Then you could have another conversation, particularly if you're new to coaching. Make these two separate conversations and not necessarily coaching conversations, just conversations. Have one where you validate continuously what the other person says. Notice what happens. People who know you very well may wonder what's up. That's fine. People who don't know you very well will just respond to what you're doing. Notice how they respond. It may be very different from what you're used to. And then share what you notice in the comments. So if you're a member of IAPPC and you're getting this in the free courses section, there's an area for comments. Share what you noticed while you were doing these conversations. You'll learn a lot by each other's shares. And if you're just taking this first class on YouTube, because the first class of each one of these courses is shared for free on YouTube, so other people can find out about them. Um, you can share it in the comments there also, but I want to encourage you to join the community so you get the whole course. And these courses are free. Go to positivepsychologycoach.org /join, and you can join right there. Okay, that's our class. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned some things that were useful to you. Bye-bye.